We should be doing everything we can to lift the world's absolute poor out of their absolute poverty.
People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. This is all wrong.
One of the things that, with regards to carbon dioxide output, one of the things that people are listening and watching might want to think about is, you know, I've been attacked many times for being a climate change denier, let's say, and I don't really care for that accusation one way or another. But one of the things I know recently from my investigations is that one of the consequences of carbon dioxide overproduction over the last 15 years, because carbon dioxide levels have been going up, and some of that seems to be a consequence of anthropogenic activity, human industrial activity, let's say, is that paradoxically, and contrary to all predictions on the environmentalist side, the planet is now 15% greener than it was in the year 2000. And 15% that's a tremendous amount. It's an area that's larger than the United States. And it isn't obvious to me that that's a bad thing. And it's more than that. The most remarkable greening has occurred in semi-arid areas. And so the deserts are supposed to expand as the globe warmed or the climate changed, because that was a fait accompli in terms of terminological transformation. And what's happened instead is that that plants have invaded the semi-arid areas to a large degree. And the reason for that is because plants have to breathe through pores. And if they open their pores to get more carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide levels are relatively low, let's say, they let water evaporate out of these pores. If there's more carbon dioxide, they can close their pores, and then it turns out that they can grow where it's drier. And that's driven not only an expansion of greening everywhere there already were plants, but the proliferation of plants into areas that couldn't support them before. And so it's very hard for me to look at that, because that's a huge change, 15%, and not think, well, maybe more plants is a good thing. But there's an additional feature that's going along with that also has to be contended with. And I don't see people on the environmental front grappling with these issues in any manner that strikes me as credible. Not only has the total biomass of plants increased tremendously, 15%, but crop yields have gone up, because it turns out that carbon dioxide is a pretty damn good fertilizer. So instead of having less food because of climate change forced by carbon dioxide, we actually have more food, and we have more food with less fertilizer. And so I think you could make a case, and I know this is utterly heretical, and it might not even be true, that carbon dioxide output's a net good. And I also know, for example, that we have somewhere between 300 and 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now. And that's actually it's actually low by historical standards, quite low. And plants really have a hard time even living at 150. So that's the cutoff for plants to breathe. And so a carbon dioxide intensive world is actually a lot more friendly to plants. Now you could say, well, we're still risking catastrophe by changing the biosphere that rapidly, because a 15% increase in plant coverage is nothing trivial. And there may be elements of that are destabilizing in some ways I don't understand. But the prediction that we were going to produce an expansion of desert, for example, and a denuding of a transformation of semi-arid areas into desert, that all seems to be like completely wrong. That did not happen. The opposite happened. And so I don't know what to make of that fact, because as far as I can tell, that fact is incontrovertibly true. And so I don't see that there's a leg for the apocalyptic environmentalists to stand on, especially given that their policies have been counterproductive and they're driving people into poverty. One hypothesis is, the planet has a limited carrying capacity, and it's a zero-sum game, and we're Malthusian, rats, and overpopulating the place, and that what we need to do in consequence is limit growth and perhaps move towards a much less populated planet. That last one is a very frightening proposition, because, as you said,
life-based ethics.
Well, who gets to go? That's the real question, and exactly how.
And who are the monsters who make the decision?
Well, exactly that. But I also think that model, it's certainly not the only model that you can derive from the data, let's say, because one of the things I learned when I was deeply investigating the relationship between economic growth and long-term environmental viability, let's say, sustainability, something like that, was that, strangely enough, and perhaps not so, if you can lift people out of absolute poverty and get them up to something approximating $5,000 a year in terms of average, say, contribution to GDP, then they stop adopting a short-term view and they start to adopt a long-term view because they have the luxury of being able to think beyond the moment. And I suppose partly why we want security, which is what wealth can offer, at least to some degree, is so that we're not bound by the absolute emergencies of the moment. If you get people up to about $5,000 per year in terms of their ability to generate income, then they start to be concerned about the environment. But the environmental concerns start to be expressed in a way that's, I would say, truly sustainable, because you could imagine that we could take a top-down approach to environmental planning. But top-down solutions have the problem of, first of all, being unitary, and second of all, so they can go catastrophically wrong if they're wrong. They're also difficult to impose. But if you make enough people, if you free enough people from absolute poverty, they start to be concerned about environmental maintenance locally. And so what you get is a distributed attempt across the world of people to improve the quality of their local environment. So that's maybe hundreds of millions of people that have a longer-term viewpoint instead of a few centralist utopians trying to govern the whole planet. And that's a much more stable solution. So we should be doing everything we can to lift the world's absolute poor out of their absolute poverty. And we do that, so then we could say, well, how do we do that? And one of the ways we do that is by moving towards the provision of free and ample energy. That's a crucial issue.
That's how we fed 5 billion extra people over the last 45 years.
And so that means we have to give some serious consideration to intelligent use of fossil fuels, which we're doing anyways.